As the CEO strolled past Buckingham Palace, he was stunned to hear a royal guard speaking fluent Mandarin, seamlessly switching to Spanish, then French. By the time the guard revealed he spoke 9 languages, the CEO was so impressed he made a £1 million offer right then and there. But the guard's response, no one saw it coming. Curious how the entire encounter played out? Make sure to hit that subscribe button and drop a comment letting us know where in the world you're watching from. Now, let's dive into the story. The morning fog hung thick over London as dawn broke across Buckingham Palace. It was one of those quintessentially British mornings where the drizzles seemed to dance in the air rather than fall, and tourists were already gathering behind the iron railings, cameras at the ready for the changing of the guard ceremony. Among them stood Alistair Greaves, a man whose tailored Savile Row suit probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. At 54, Greaves had built an empire that spanned continents, turning his father's modest trading company into Greaves Global, a multinational corporation worth billions. But that morning, Greaves wasn't thinking about quarterly reports or acquisition deals. He'd flown in from Singapore the night before, jet-lagged and irritable, and had decided to take a walk to clear his head before his meeting with the Chancellor. The ceremony was just background noise to him, another quaint British tradition that tourists loved but held no particular fascination for a man who'd seen everything money could buy. The guards stood motionless in their iconic scarlet tunics and towering bearskin hats, their faces hidden behind the traditional stoic mask that had made them famous worldwide. To most observers, they were interchangeable figures in an ancient pageant. But Sergeant Idris Nouri was anything but ordinary, though nobody in that crowd could have guessed it from looking at him, standing at attention in the front rank. Idris had already been awake for 4 hours. His routine was military precision, incarnate, up at 0400, physical training, inspection of uniform and equipment, briefing, and then the ceremonial duties that had become as natural to him as breathing. At 29, he'd served 8 years in the Grenadier Guards, but his journey to this moment had begun long before he'd ever heard of Buckingham Palace. The crowd pressed closer as the ceremony commenced, the familiar sound of military bands echoing off the palace walls. Greaves checked his Rolex. He had 30 minutes before his driver would collect him. He sipped his espresso from a paper cup, bought from a street vendor who'd probably charged him triple the normal price for being obviously wealthy, and prepared to endure the tourist spectacle. That's when the commotion started. Near the front of the crowd, a well-dressed Chinese man in his 60s began speaking rapidly, his voice rising with unmistakable panic. The tourists around him exchanged confused glances, some pulling out their phones to translate, others simply staring as the man's distress became increasingly apparent. What the hu dal dola? What jobadal what the hu dollar? What jobadal what the hu dollar? Arik called out, his hands frantically searching through his pockets and briefcase. The panic in his voice was universal, transcending language barriers. This was clearly someone important. His clothes, his bearing, everything about him suggested diplomatic status, and he was in serious trouble. The crowd began to murmur, some trying to help despite the language barrier, others simply recording the scene on their phones. A few enterprising tourists pulled out translation apps, but the man was speaking too quickly and emotionally for the technology to keep up. The situation was rapidly becoming a diplomatic incident waiting to happen, and that's when something extraordinary occurred. One of the motionless guards, Sergeant Idris Nouri, though no one in the crowd knew his name, turned his head slightly toward the commotion. For a moment, he remained perfectly still, processing what he'd heard. Then, in a voice that cut through the morning air with calm authority, he spoke. 请保持冷静，先生，我们会帮您找到护照的。 请告诉我您最后一次看到他是在什么地方。 If the effect was electric. The Chinese diplomat stopped mid-sentence, his eyes widening in shock. The crowd fell silent, heads turning from the distressed man to the guard who had just spoken fluent Mandarin with what sounded like a Beijing accent. Greaves' espresso cup froze halfway to his lips. In 30 years of international business, he'd heard plenty of people speak foreign languages, but this was different. The guard hadn't just translated, he'd spoken with the natural rhythm and intonation of a native speaker, using formal honorifics and diplomatic language that suggested not just fluency, but cultural understanding. The Chinese diplomat, who Greaves now recognized from business circles as Dr. Wei Zhengming, a senior trade advisor, began responding rapidly in Mandarin. The guard listened intently, occasionally nodding, then responded with what appeared to be instructions. Within minutes, palace security had been discreetly alerted, and a systematic search for the missing passport was underway. But Greaves wasn't. Watching the search, he was studying the guard with the intensity of a predator who'd spotted prey. In his world, language skills weren't just useful, they were weapons. Every major deal he'd lost, every negotiation that had gone sideways, every cultural misunderstanding that had cost him millions, could have been avoided with the right linguistic expertise. The guard, still maintaining his ceremonial posture, continued to coordinate between Dr. Wei and the security team. What struck Greaves wasn't just the language ability, but the way the man managed to remain in character while solving a complex problem. Most people would have broken protocol, stepped out of formation, made a show of their helpfulness. This guard was providing diplomatic-level assistance while maintaining the stoic composure that his position demanded. After 10 minutes, a palace security officer approached with a passport that had been found near the Victoria Memorial. Dr. Wei's relief was palpable as he thanked the guard profusely in Mandarin. The guard's response was brief and professional, and then he returned to his position as if nothing had happened. The crowd began to disperse, many tourists taking photos and whispering about what they'd just witnessed. But Greaves remained rooted to the spot, his mind racing with possibilities. He pulled out his phone and made a quick call to his assistant. "Sarah, I need you to find out everything you can about the guards at Buckingham Palace. Specifically, I need to know about one who speaks Mandarin." "Yes, I'm serious. No, this isn't a joke. I need the information within the hour." The ceremony concluded, and as the guards began their precisely choreographed march back to Wellington Barracks, Greaves followed at a discreet distance. His business instincts, honed by decades of recognizing opportunity where others saw routine, were screaming at him that he'd just witnessed something extraordinary. Sarah's callback came as he reached St. James's Park. "Sir, I've made some inquiries. The guard you're asking about is likely Sergeant Idris Nouri of the Grenadier Guards. According to my contact at the Ministry of Defense, he's considered one of their most exemplary soldiers. There's not much public information, but apparently he has an unusual educational background." "How unusual?" Greaves asked, settling onto a park bench with a clear view of the barracks entrance. "Well, he's originally from Nigeria, came to the UK for university, studied modern languages at Oxford on a full scholarship. First-class honours. The interesting part is that he turned down a career in the Foreign Office to join the military. That was 8 years ago." Greaves felt his pulse quicken. A first-class Oxford graduate in modern languages who'd chosen military service over diplomatic career advancement. This was either someone with an unusual sense of duty or someone running from something. Either way, it suggested a character that might be worth investigating. "What else do you know about his language abilities?" "That's where it gets interesting, sir. My contact mentioned that he's often called upon for translation services during state visits. Apparently, he's fluent in at least 7 or 8 languages. There are rumors of more, but those are the ones that have been officially documented." Greaves ended the call and sat back, watching the barracks entrance. 7 or 8 languages. At Greaves Global, they employed dozens of translators and cultural consultants, paying them collectively millions of pounds annually. Most specialized in 2 or 3 languages at most. Someone with that level of linguistic ability, combined with military discipline and cultural sensitivity, would be worth their weight in gold in the corporate world. The break period came at 1100 hours. Greaves had been waiting for over an hour, ignoring 3 phone calls from his assistant and 2 from potential clients. When Sergeant Nouri emerged from the barracks in casual military dress, Greaves approached. With the calculated confidence that had served him well in countless business negotiations. "Sergeant Nouri," he called out, extending a business card. "Alistair Greaves, Greaves Global. I witnessed your assistance to Dr. Wei this morning. Quite impressive." Idris paused, accepting the card with polite wariness. Up close, Greaves could see intelligent dark eyes that seemed to assess and categorize everything around them. This wasn't a man who missed details. "Thank you, sir. I'm glad we could help resolve the situation." The accent was educated, refined, clearly Oxfordshire end, but underneath it, Greaves detected the subtle rhythms that suggested multiple linguistic influences. This was someone who thought in several languages. "Your Mandarin is exceptional." May I ask how many languages you speak? Idris glanced at his watch. He had precisely 28 minutes of break time remaining. I'm conversational in 12, fluent in 9. The casualness of the response nearly floored Greaves. 12 languages. In the business world, someone with that capability would command salaries in the high 6 figures, possibly 7. And here was this man, standing in Wellington Barracks, in a standard military uniform, probably earning less in a year than Greaves spent on wine. 9 fluently, Greaves repeated, trying to keep his voice level. Which 9? English, French, German, Spanish, Arabic, Mandarin, Portuguese, Russian, and Yoruba. The others vary depending on context and necessity. Greaves felt like he'd struck oil. Languages weren't just communication tools in international business, they were keys to entire markets, cultural contexts, negotiation styles. Someone who could navigate between English and Russian, Arabic and Mandarin, Spanish and German, wasn't just a translator. They were a cultural bridge, a diplomatic asset, a competitive advantage that money usually couldn't buy. Sergeant, I'm going to make you an offer that might sound unusual, Greaves said, pulling out his phone to access his digital contract templates. I'd like to offer you a position with my company, Chief Cultural Strategist, £1 million, annually, plus benefits, plus equity options. Idris didn't react with the shock or excitement that Greaves had expected. Instead, he seemed to consider the offer with the same calm assessment he'd shown during the passport incident. That's very generous, Mr. Greaves, but I have commitments here. Commitments? Greaves pressed. Sergeant, with respect, you're earning what, £30,000 annually? Maybe 40, with your rank and experience. I'm offering you 25 times that amount. The compensation isn't the issue, sir. This response stopped Greaves cold. In his experience, everyone had a price. Not necessarily monetary. Some people wanted power. Others wanted recognition. Some wanted security. But everyone wanted something, enough to change their circumstances. Here was a man who'd just been offered generational wealth and seemed genuinely unmoved by it. Then, what is the issue? Idris gestured toward the palace, visible in the distance. I have duties until 1600 hours. After that, I have evening training commitments. On weekends, I have ceremonial responsibilities. My service contract has 3 years remaining. The simplicity of the statement was stunning. Greaves had negotiated with heads of state, convinced billionaires to merge their companies, talked venture capitalists into funding impossible dreams, but he'd never encountered someone who seemed so genuinely indifferent to personal gain. You do realize, Greaves said carefully, that with your linguistic abilities, you could command any salary you wanted in the private sector. The Foreign Office, international consulting, corporate strategy, the world would be your oyster. Yes, sir, I'm aware of that. Then why are you here? Idris looked back toward the barracks, where other soldiers were visible through the windows, some reading, others writing letters, all maintaining the quiet discipline that defined military life. Mr. Greaves, when I was 12 years old, my family moved from Lagos to Manchester. My father was a petroleum engineer. My mother was a nurse. They'd saved for years to give me opportunities they'd never had. I was the only black student in most of my classes, one of the few who spoke English as a second language, and definitely the only one whose parents worked 3 jobs between them to pay for everything. Greaves listened, recognizing the cadence of someone who'd thought deeply about their choices. The other students had advantages. I couldn't compete with family connections, cultural knowledge, economic security. What I had was languages. My grandmother had insisted I learn Arabic for religious reasons. My mother spoke French from her convent education. My father knew some German from his technical training. When we moved to England, I realized that languages weren't just communication tools, they were survival skills. The story was emerging with the kind of detail that suggested it had been examined and re-examined over years of reflection. By the time I reached Oxford, I was fluent in 7 languages and conversational in 4 more. My professors assumed I'd join the diplomatic corps or pursue an academic career. The logical path would have been the Foreign Office, where my abilities would have guaranteed rapid advancement and significant influence. So why didn't you take that path? Because logic isn't everything, Mr. Greaves. During my final year at Oxford, I attended a remembrance ceremony for fallen soldiers. I watched the guards, listened to the precision of their movements, saw the way they honored service above self. I realized that everything I'd achieved, my education, my opportunities, My freedom to choose my path existed because other people had made sacrifices to protect those possibilities. Greaves found himself genuinely moved by the explanation, though his business mind continued calculating the potential value of this man's principles. The military offered me something that civilian careers couldn't, Idris continued. Purpose beyond personal advancement. The discipline to excel not for my own benefit, but as part of something larger. When I stand guard at the palace, I'm not just performing a job, I'm maintaining a tradition that represents stability, continuity, and service. But surely, Greaves pressed, you could serve your country just as effectively in a civilian capacity. Your language skills could advance British interests through diplomacy, trade negotiations, cultural exchange programs. Perhaps, but service isn't just about maximizing your individual contribution. It's about understanding your place in a larger structure, accepting that your personal desires are secondary to collective responsibility. The conversation was unlike any negotiation Greaves had ever experienced. Usually, when he offered someone life-changing money, the discussion became about terms, conditions, start dates. Here, he was receiving a philosophy lesson from someone who seemed genuinely immune to financial temptation. Let me ask you this, Greaves said, changing tactics. What happens when your military service ends? You can't stand guard forever. I'll reassess then. Perhaps I'll pursue diplomatic service, maybe teaching, possibly international development work. The languages will always be useful, but they're tools, not ends in themselves. And if I told you that you could achieve more good in the world with my company's resources than you ever could as an individual soldier? We operate in countries, employ over 60,000 people, influence policy at the highest levels. Your linguistic and cultural expertise could shape how Western businesses engage with emerging markets, how international partnerships are structured, how cultural barriers are overcome. For the first time, Idris seemed genuinely interested in the proposition. Greaves recognized the shift. He'd found an angle that resonated with the man's values rather than his ambitions. What kind of work would that involve? Greaves pulled up his phone and began showing Idris examples of recent company projects. Last month, we lost a £2 billion contract in Saudi Arabia because our negotiation team misunderstood a cultural reference that completely changed the meaning of a key proposal section. The month before that, a partnership with a Russian energy company collapsed when our translators missed the nuanced differences between formal and informal language protocols. The examples were having an effect. Idris was asking pointed questions about the specific cultural contexts, suggesting alternative approaches, identifying the systematic problems that led to these failures. The issue isn't just translation, Idris observed. It's cultural fluency. Most international businesses treat language as a technical skill, like accounting or legal expertise. But language is inseparable from worldview, from relationship dynamics, from power structures. Exactly, Greaves said, sensing an opening. That's precisely why I need someone with your background, not just someone who can translate words, but someone who can navigate cultural contexts, anticipate misunderstandings, build bridges between different ways of thinking. And you believe this work would have more impact than military service? I believe it would have different impact, potentially broader impact. Instead of protecting one nation's interests, you'd be facilitating understanding between nations, cultures, economic systems. Idris was quiet for several minutes, clearly weighing considerations that went far beyond salary and career advancement. Greaves waited, recognizing that this wasn't a moment for pressure tactics. Mr. Greaves, if I were to consider such a position, and I'm not saying I would, what would the practical requirements be? The question sent Greaves' pulse racing. This was the first indication that his offer might be seriously considered. Travel, obviously. You'd spend about 40% of your time overseas, working directly with our international partners. The rest would be based in London, developing cultural strategy, training our negotiation teams, reviewing contracts for cultural sensitivity. And the timeline, I'd want you to start as soon as possible. We have a major expansion into Southeast Asian markets planned for next quarter, and your language abilities would be invaluable. Mr. Greaves, Idris said, finally, I'll consider your offer, but I have conditions that are non-negotiable. The word conditions in a salary negotiation usually meant the deal was moving forward. Greaves tried to contain his excitement. I'm listening. First, I maintain my military commission and ceremonial duties, 8 shifts per month minimum. My service commitment takes precedence over all other obligations. The requirement was unusual, but not insurmountable. In fact, Greaves realized, having an employee who maintained active military status might actually be beneficial for certain international contracts, particularly in regions where military service was highly respected. That could be arranged. What else? Second, I have absolute authority over cultural strategy decisions. If I determine that a business practice or negotiation approach is culturally inappropriate or potentially offensive, my judgment is final. This was more challenging. Greaves was accustomed to making all strategic decisions himself, but he recognized that cultural expertise was meaningless if it could be overruled by business considerations. Agreed, within reason. We'd need to establish clear protocols for such situations. Third, I want equity participation that vests over 7 years, not the standard 3. I'm not interested in short-term gains. If I'm going to help build something, I want to be invested in its long-term success. The final condition revealed a sophistication that impressed Greaves. This wasn't someone who could be bought with immediate gratification. He was thinking strategically about value creation and long-term alignment. Done, Greaves said, extending his hand. When can you start? I'll need to review the complete contract terms, discuss the arrangement with my commanding officer, and ensure that my military obligations can be properly accommodated. If everything aligns, I could begin in 6 weeks. They shook hands, and Greaves realized that he'd just made one of the most unusual hires of his career. As Idris returned to barracks, checking his watch to ensure he wasn't late for afternoon duties, Greaves remained in the park, already planning how to leverage his new assets, extraordinary abilities. 6 months later, Greaves Global's international revenues had increased by 47%, with the company successfully entering 5 new markets that had previously been considered too culturally complex to navigate, and every weekend, tourists at Buckingham Palace could still see Sergeant Idris Nouri standing guard, though now they whispered about the £1,000,000 soldier who'd never abandoned his post. The story became legendary in both military and business circles. The man who negotiated corporate deals worth billions on weekdays and stood guard over British tradition on weekends, proving that some values truly aren't for sale, they can only be rented, with honor and discipline as the terms of the contract.